Thank you so much for joining us for this closing session. I don't know about you all, but I am quite tired. Yay! Okay, good. I'm quite tired, but I'm also very energized by a lot of the conversations, and very much looking forward to our last conversation today. So in today's theme, between deterrence and non-violence, we have sought to reflect on the ways in which we understand peace and security, from pacifism and non-violence to deterrence and the perceived need for military security. This panel looks at a very specific dilemma. We've called it the dilemma of the tech panopticon. Maybe that means something to you, maybe it doesn't, but I think what it comes down to is that new technologies are controlling public space through the use of surveillance in the name of safety. And at the same time, civilians are using technology to resist and reclaim who surveils in the name of accountability. They're also using their lives and their experiences to resist and to reclaim. And this panel presents three very different perspectives on these dilemmas of surveillance and the tech panopticon. So joining me to discuss this are Ophelia Rivas, who is an advocate for the elders and the land of the O'odham nations and the land occupied by the governments of the United States and Mexico. Bruna Martins dos Santos, who is a policy and advocacy manager on technology threats and opportunities at Witness. And Jack Isles, who is an architect, a researcher, and a cartographer, working on issues of migration and border violence in collaboration with border forensics. I'm going to be asking each of them two questions about the different perspectives around this dilemma, and then we'll be taking some questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, start thinking of them, keeping them in mind. We're looking forward to those as well. So Ophelia, I wanted to start with you. Mm-hmm. What is the experience of surveillance of the O'odham nations?
Porque pasoche mo matiki de amje de tatak to how much come to do it got amje de me piapotak the toaka gachi motam. So at the beginning of our contact of our people, there's been conflict, and which also created an international border to divide our homelands into two countries. The two countries are now creating militarization along the border, which is 62 miles of our lands that are now a reservation on the U.S. side, and communities on the Mexico side that are not recognized as such. But it creates this militarization along the border that has created this living in fear along this border. There's also very much enforcement of immigration laws on our people that have suffered not only brutality from the militarization, which is the Border Patrol and ICE and other agents of the government, but also that we have been, people have been killed, people have been detained, deported, imprisoned, and not to say enough about our culture that's under threat and the violation of our human rights and our individual rights and especially our cultural rights, because that's our homelands, original homelands. So I can go on for days about what happens to our people and what surveillance looks like on our land. But I have some images there on the wall of the integrated fixed tower that's also on the Gaza Strip that today is not weaponized, but you might think that, the state of affairs in the world, that eventually they'll be weaponized. And we see it as constant intrusion into our lives, our everyday lives that we have, because I live under that tower. I endure all the things that the Border Patrol have done to the people. not only did they put up a vehicle barrier to stop vehicles of our people from crossing to communities just 15 miles or less across the U.S.-Mexico border, but now they're putting up a metal wall that's forcing our people to move, hours to get through a port of entry and show proper IDs to cross the border to come to communities for ceremony, for birthing ceremonies, for community social interactions and keeping in contact with our people. So it's continuous, it was traumatic for me to be here in Spain. The tormentors of my people came from here. My people didn't properly do the Christian sign of the cross and a limb fell off. The tormentors also enforced Christianity on our people, and thereby what I carry that surname, that I live with today, because also I was born without a birth certificate. So there's a lot of different things that I'm here to say, but also that, peace is always in our minds and in our hearts, and that if we are all here together to talk about building peace, that I think that is a critical point of humanity to begin in that discussion, and that's why I'm here today.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ophelia.
Thank you.
So from this, I'm actually going to move over to Jack for the next question. Ophelia has shared an experience of what living under surveillance looks like, and you look at it from a different perspective. So you have seen how geospatial technology has been used to surveil and control people through the work that you do. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that we are dealing with, very much in the work that we do, which is more from an analytical perspective, dealing with numerous different sort of geospatial technologies, and have watched in the last 10 years a kind of very distinct sort of evolution of those technologies, which I guess I'll speak more to. I think that, predominant still is very much the kind of panopticon of aerial surveillance as defined and developed by the kind of military-industrial organization, and this is something that continues to be a sort of central focus when pushing back against and resisting against and thinking critically about forms of state-sponsored surveillance. But what I wanted to talk to more about today was more, I guess, 2 points that our work is looking at, in which geospatial technologies are kind of changing the dynamic, I think. The first is, I guess, the expansion recently of what geospatial information constitutes with the kind of evolution or revolution of biometrics and digital forms of bordering. Now in today's age, geospatial information is now being paired with how we are using apps, how we were, obligatory systems of inscription that are being imposed by immigration officers, specifically in Europe, but the world over. And this is kind of creating a system in which the kind of pairing of this data is creating a new regime in which geospatial data describes not only where we are and when we are, but who we are, how we are. And I think this is really defining a kind of the new paradigm of the embodied border, right? As in, it's no longer possible to simply cross a border and be kind of freed from that process of bordering, but instead we kind of wear with us and carry with us this embodied border that is kind of embedded in our increasingly expanded digital footprint. So we're doing a lot of work in the context of London and the United Kingdom, looking at ways to kind of push against the new empowered forms of biometric data regulations that they have, that's been sponsored by the Home Office there. And I think on the other end of the spectrum, we've been seeing something that's kind of quite different, or at least unique in some ways, is the the use of surveillance technologies and geospatial data to precisely unwitness events or remove the presence of governmental officials from acts of state violence. And I think the example that we are kind of focusing on is in the context of the central Mediterranean. So there was a time not so long ago in which EU NAVFORMED and various different European naval forces were quite literally involved in search and rescue operations in the context of the central Mediterranean, which was of course obliging them to take back basically migrants in distress to European soil. And now there has been this insurgence of the use of drone surveillance, satellite data, other forms of Earth observation technologies and remote sensing to precisely take their vessels out of the water, to remove them from having the obligation as dictated by international law to provide assistance to migrant vessels in distress, and instead orchestrate a system of surveillance which is conducted at a distance from afar. And this is, of course, enabling them to pass data on instead to organizations such as the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, who then, are involved in various pushbacks, pullbacks, and widespread human rights violations. So I think that there's both this kind of spectrum of an amplification of what is constituted now by geospatial data, and also a re-engineering of that very data in order to provide geospatial distance between the perpetrators of state violence and the victims.
Thank you for explaining that, and I think, Jack, what you are telling us in some ways is you're unpacking some of the technology of the kind of towers that Ophelia is living under, right? So when you described that the capabilities of the different technologies of the tracing and the carrying of the border within, you're also describing basically from a technical perspective that experience. So I think I want to turn to you now, Bruna, for a slightly different perspective on that. In your experience, we've heard a little bit from Jack on how state surveillance is changing, but I know that you're watching out for a few other things, maybe more related also to the use of artificial intelligence. So if you could share a little bit with us about that.
Thank you. Thank you, it's working, okay. Well, very nice to be at this panel. Very, very nice to see a full room and the last panel of the day. So kudos to build up your peace conference for the room. It would be a mistake not to start this conversation without saying that any talks about technology need to acknowledge that this is about power. This is about perpetrating structures of power, like from the north towards the global majority. And a lot of this conversation is really about, benefiting certain groups of people, what was referred yesterday as the tech bros, or, also benefiting a lot of those more rich masses and so on. I'm Brazilian. I worked a couple of years on surveillance topics a couple of years ago, and I think that over the pandemic, I'll start with the pandemic maybe. I think that's a really good example in where we see the change of paradigm between what we saw before as something that was targeted towards certain citizens and a massification of surveillance technologies. And this is probably or most likely a result of a certain series of things. The first one is commercialization of surveillance, like with states like Israel or many other states in the world offering and creating surveillance technologies. There is a certain level of banalization of the use of those tools in a way that we didn't really see before. We saw some actions, maybe, Germany is very famous for the use of surveillance technologies on journalists a couple of years ago. Across the years in Latin America, we also saw a lot of targeting of activists in the Amazon or some things like that, but we do live a different moment like that right now that is facilitated by the existence of technologies, commercialization of surveillance, and also the massive collection of data that's performed not only by states, but also by private companies. And the final moment that is these two groups of actors meeting together, right, and coming up to these public-private partnerships that allow for the transfer of data without safeguards, without, any sort of concerns or capacity building in terms of what governments should actually do with all the information they have about ourselves and how they should move on from that, right? I think when we look into the AI landscape, AI kind of offers, not kind of, but does offer like uncountable, experiences and ways of making the situation even worse. The first one is the potential for processing data. We're talking about much bigger scales and much bigger spaces for processing that. We're also talking about the use of AI for sharing much bigger amounts of content online. So when we talk about the AI slop or how people are, drowning in deep fakes and misinformation nowadays, it's also about that. And last but not least, the extent of AI that allows for all of this content to arrive at the people that need to be manipulated and that need to see these types of counter narratives and stuff like that. And maybe just to wrap up this, I'll just say 2 examples. India, not only I state for some of its surveillance practices. I'm sure a lot of us have heard about the Aadhaar case, for social insurance and social security that was later transformed into a surveillance kind of system. Nowadays, they are reviewing their guidelines for synthetic content, and that might result in even more tracking of users online and tracking of content for many people. And second, both my colleagues at Witness, Sam Gregory and Massa, they wrote an article about how disinformation was being used targeting Iranians during the attacks by the State of Israel, and how that's allowed for people to be even more confused about the situation, when to evacuate, and how we live in this context where visual truth is not only cracked, but it's under a lot of questionings. So maybe I'll stop here and then we can continue the conversation.
So that's quite an unraveling of this issue of surveillance in the different ways that that is showing up. And Bruna, I thought it was really interesting how you also connected it to the way that content is being targeted towards people and how it actually flows into some of the other issues that we've talked about here in terms of influence and manipulation, etc. So that's what we're talking about. But then there's also some things that we can do to push back against this power, as you call it, so not just the technology, but against the power dynamics that are coming up through this. So Ophelia, if I can turn to you again and ask you, what is the resistance that the Odam nation is putting up to the use of surveillance, and also what are the consequences of this resistance?
Surveillance really criminalizes our people by giving that idea that you are a criminal and that you are constantly monitored, and that the people are feeling that they have done something wrong. So, and in some instances, people have said, well, why don't you build a wall, to block their surveillance? And I would say, well, I'm not a criminal. Why should I feel like I'm a criminal? I'm not a criminal. Our people are not criminals. And I think that the basic idea of resistance is just to try to remain who we are and be strong in who we are. There's really, in the land of the federal government in the United States, they have eminent domain over any part of what they do. So you're led to believe that either you comply or you face the consequences. And as you saw in time, that all the people especially the poor people of the United States, certainly face the consequences when they didn't have enough food, they don't have no medical care, and in the shutdown of the American government system. So that impacts our people greatly, So we're looking at resistance in a way that we've always resisted, is to remain who we are, trying to strengthen our cultural way of life and survive. I have, we have tried to document the abuses and tried to educate our people of the technology and what they're collecting on our people. But when I went to the airport, they take your picture and there you are again. They've taken your picture, they know what your iris looks like, and they know where you travel. So I think that's the idea of that whole system, is that you're basically powerless unless you are wealthy, like some people, and can control that technology.
Ophelia, can I ask you a small follow-up question?
Yes.
If I may. I think one of the things that I picked up from what you were saying now is this idea that even under the eye, when you're surveilled, you feel like maybe you've done something wrong, and this idea of resistance through continuing to be who you are and continuing to resist how you have always resisted, which is to continue your way of life.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about that? Can you tell us about are there moments when people in your nation think, I'm tired of this surveillance. Maybe I can't do this anymore. Or times when they say, actually, you know what, this is so important, and what we're doing is an act of resistance.
The moment my work started was when we were crossing the border, and the Border Patrol came and had 13 elders over 70 years old on their knees with their hand behind their back, and they're vulgarly being spoken to in Spanish, which they don't speak Spanish, they don't speak English. And so I'm watching their reaction, and somebody started laughing because it's that is a nervous laugh, and to watch that kind of interaction with a society that does not understand who we are and what we do as a people, that our lands are under occupation, that we have to carry documents to cross, I think that what we've decided, as we've always decided, is just to remain who we are. We have a ceremony that we conduct that we do a deer hunt, a traditional deer hunt, and for the past years, the Border Patrol will fly over with helicopters and with all their equipment to disrupt our way of life, but we continue to do that because that's who we are, and I think that's our resistance right there, is to just remain strong.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So just to come back a little bit to other forms of resistance as well, I got a little emotional in hearing Ophelia, so I'm taking a second, sorry. Jack, you were talking about geospatial technology before. I know that as well as observing the way that geospatial technology is becoming, is basically strengthening surveillance even further, you've also been looking at how geospatial technology can be used to advocate against surveillance and control. So can you tell us a little bit about that, about this kind of other side of the technology? Yeah.
Definitely. I think, in many ways, what the work that we do is also, to preface this, it's kind of looking at surveillance and human rights violations, but it's more or less, as a broader field, we're kind of looking more at the creation of hostile environments. This is a methodology employed by state entities in which there's the deployment of militarization, the deployment of surveillance systems, but there's also a transformation of the physical environment, or an adoption of the physical environment itself into a sort of weaponized space, or the sort of ubiquity of the hostile environment. I think within our work, there's always this kind of dilemma that, operating in a kind of analytical space from afar, there is always this difficulty in which we are, often in order to hold account governments, in order to produce the documentation that is legally valid to say this environment of hostility exists and it is causing physical harm or death to people within this context. In order to structure that argument within a legal fora, we are often working with the technologies in a way which we are trying to denounce. I think this is a kind of ongoing issue for us. Within the context of the Central Mediterranean, for example, we've often conducted activities that, for example, have used satellite imagery to prove the presence of naval vessels that ignored distress calls, precisely, of migrant vessels in distress, arguing for acts of state negligence and resistance to provide assistance. But again, using the very technologies that they deploy. And I think In some cases, we've again used kind of complex arrays of environmental data sets that are coming from state government sources to build the kind of technological methodologies to say, the organization of these surveillance systems, very much analogous to the organization of surveillance systems in the United States, is contributing to the, pushing, say, people in the move into increasingly dangerous areas of, the desert, for example. We did an investigation in Niger that was very much about that. I think in all of this, there is the constant issue that we are always dealing with and trying to expand on and better ourselves in our practice is the inherent inaccessibility for these types of methods of resistance for affected communities. I think this is like a cornerstone, probably the most difficult issue that we face is how to translate these forms of resistance, that they are not simply kind of artifacts of European educational institutions and European advocacy organizations, but these actually, involve and are empowered by affected communities. And I think this kind of this happens in various different ways of engagement in some projects. In some ways, often I think, we have kind of sometimes translated the learnings that we have developed through these exercises into things like children's books, for example, that somehow this, for me at least, and for many I think involved in this specific investigation, was a far more powerful tool than all the other mechanisms which we were trying to develop to hold this specific entity accountable in the eyes of the kind of legal fora, let's say. But yeah.
Yeah. I think, I appreciate the fact that you spelled out so clearly the sort of dual use nature of these technologies, right, and how you see that very clearly. And it's interesting because this issue of dual use has come up in other conversations as well, not just on surveillance technologies, but on some of the other technologies that we've looked at today. We had a conversation about AI where we also touched briefly on that issue. And so, when you have a technology that has dual use, one of the things that is very important is how you regulate it and how you legislate it. So Bruna, if I can turn to you with one more question, which is what policies and legislation do we need to curtail the use of technology that is perhaps has other uses, etc., but to curtail its use for surveillance?
Mm-hmm. I think I'll start by saying two very simple things. There is surveillance nowadays is ambient, it's everywhere. Think smart cities, think facial recognition, license plate readers, everything, our phones, computers, home devices, all of it. It's ambient, it's everywhere. Mm-hmm. The second point is we also live in this state or this place where we have a bigger normalization of emergency powers. And what I mean by that is this either this overburdening or extension of state powers for, be more aggressive towards migrants, to be more aggressive in the policing, capacities of the state and so on. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because I think that surveillance is not a technical issue, it's a purely democratical one. And in order for it to be curtailed or solved or even limited a little bit, we do need to work a little bit better in policies that have human rights and privacy at the very core of it, in a moment where we have, much bigger power towards private companies, so it's already a complicated thing. Also, when we're talking about surveillance, it is complicated to be at a space where you need to require more attention from states, because, I can say that maybe to my current government, but I could not say that to Bolsonaro, not at all, So mm-hmm. It is kind of a very fine line as well as to how you advocate for that. But in the general sense, I would say that it's important to advocate for data privacy and very clear guidelines on how to protect, how to process, and how to deal with all of that. And even more so now in the age of AI, where algorithms and how all of those LLMs and systems will evolve, they will become new layers of problems where, deepfakes and spaces and tools like Sora 2, the OpenAI visual timeline that replicates likeness and, shows Sam Altman stealing processors from targets. It is a space where we need to control and think about solutions for that. But again, it's a complicated space when we talk about states. I think last but not least, I would mention also strategic litigation. Many nations in Latin America have been investing a lot of money and a lot of capacity in strategic litigation, as like taking some of those cases to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, to our Brazilian Supreme Court, and just so in trying to advocate, to create the jurisprudence, and try to make policymakers think more clearly about those things. Like one very famous case in Brazil was the use of geospatial technologies during the COVID pandemic to track, how people travel between places. And this will become, once it ends, one of our landmark cases to try to avoid this normalization of the emergency powers and to try to avoid the state control as kind of a good thing in a way that people don't really or shouldn't really be questioning. So my answer would be that, like, regulations to the extent that you can talk, and you can talk about it under like a democratic space, and also strategic litigation and documentation, as Jack was saying, towards the abuses from states and authorities.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all three of you for everything you shared already. I think there's a real, whenever I think about some of the work that we do using data, and watching things and trying to report on things, I often find myself thinking, how close are we walking to surveillance? And who is watching, and who is this making safe, and who is this making them feel watched, and therefore experiencing this kind of watchful eye that can also turn to why are you watching? What is this turning me into? What kind of a subject? It's definitely something that comes up, not just in the kind of direct surveillance that you're talking about, but I think in a lot of the work that a lot of us do, using data. So that's my personal reflection, and with that I would love to open it up to all of you for questions. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 3 questions, and then we'll bring it back to the speakers. So yeah, any questions? There should be a roving mic. Yes, there's a roving mic. I made a mistake and I didn't ask the speakers to pick up translation equipment. So if you do ask a question in Spanish, I will translate it.
I will not manage to ask the question in Spanish, so...
That's fortunate for me.
I try Portuguese. But so my question would be, from the peace building perspective, and Helena, you just touched on this in terms of some of the things we're trying to do as peace builders. We want access to what some people consider private data, but the broader perspective on that, I would ask the question, as peace building is often about the endeavor of building a legitimate public authority which citizens can trust. And I worry with this discussion that it moves people towards, we don't trust government and we don't trust tech, trust nothing. So how do we deal with that challenge in the sense of saying to people, well, because big tech will use this language and say, don't have EIDs, just use Google login and Apple login. I would much prefer to have a Portuguese EID and the European EID initiative and log in with my EID than be logging in with Google. And I just like some reflection on that, and how do we strike that balance, and trust in legitimate public authority should be fostered and not undermined, which I'm sure isn't what you're attempting to do, but that would be my question.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple more before coming back. Yep.
Thank you. Ophelia, I have a question for you. I was wondering what gives you all the strength and energy and hope in your nonviolent resistance, especially with the current US government? Thank you.
Thank you so much for an incredible panel. I have a question, probably mostly to Jack, because it's something that you said around the tools you use to kind of, to document and resist and challenge and fight back. Because I'm thinking about Audre and what she wrote about the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, and about, if we are anti-surveillance, but then are using the same tools to kind of go against the structures of oppression, like, is that a strategy to what end? What should we think about?
Fantastic. We will come back for more questions, but let me just pause here, because otherwise it's a lot to ask of our speakers to remember all of that. I said I wasn't going to do this, and now I'm going to go against my own instructions to all of you and do it. I think there was actually a question for each of you. So maybe if I can actually start with the first question on, do we trust an authority or do we trust technology? I think, Bruna, you probably have something to say about that, and then Jack and Ophelia, if you also want to add to that, absolutely do. Yeah.
It's a really complicated question, to be honest. Like, I would really love to say that I trust technology, I trust big tech companies, and I trust governments, but unfortunately I cannot say that, at least not in the world we live in. Maybe as a Brazilian living in Germany, I get to say that I trust them a little bit, but people in the MENA region, people in many other different regions of the world cannot say that. Definitely not, right? Because these are the spaces where big tech companies are partnering up with governments to have more access to data, to control citizens, and to restrain rights. So I'm not providing any answers to this question, but I think it's really trying to strike a balance in terms of like introducing safeguards, even though they're minimal, but there needs to be safeguards towards the use of facial recognition and biometric, data collection, or safeguards towards the state activities in terms of processing data and to what levels of sensitive personal data they can have access to which reasons. And basically what I'm telling you guys, it's the playbook of a data protection act or a data protection law in that sense that tries to center the data subject at the very, as the main priority of this conversation, and tries to say, hey, academic organizations might need to use this data for certain purposes. If it's not pervasive, it's not a problem. Governments, they need to use the data to, provide services. If it's also not pervasive, it's not a problem. But unfortunately, I think the balance is not in trying to trust these organizations, but the balance is more on the side of these actors, both private sector and governments, in to try to curtail their own activities and not to go overboard in what they do and the reasons why they process data for it. So
safeguards and guardrails is what you're saying. So Ophelia, I'm hearing you already. So do you want to say something about that? And perhaps if you might also want to address the question that was addressed directly to you about strength and hope and resistance.
Well, all these hundreds of years of the United States government and the government of Mexico, it's very hard for indigenous people to trust any part of that. And even though our young people are all engaged in the new technology, it's very difficult to say, but we do need to find some advocacy to somebody to advocate for us to kind of curtail the amount of data that's been in access, being used, especially against individuals or indigenous peoples and people that are minorities, and we see that all the time. That kind of access is very extreme. So if there was some kind of a limit to that, that would be what I would say is we need to advocate for that certain limit of how much access of that data, especially personal data, that people can use. And as far as the strength of why I'm here and continuing to do the work, it's a matter of survival, I guess. It's really a matter of survival for my people, that we continue to advocate for our rights, cultural rights and human rights, although that there's so many violations against our people and all indigenous people, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And just being here even inspires me, to what I can bring home and say, these women that I met, were so strong, in the pursuit of peace for the world, and that gives me strength. So thank you for that question. Thank you.
Jack, to turn to the last question to you, you were asked another question about dual use and dual use of tools and how you square that. I'm going to make it harder for you. Yeah. I'm also going to talk, because you thought that wasn't hard enough already. Would you also be willing to address the dual use of data, which I think is a little bit what Bruna was touching on, and certainly something that I think we grapple with as well in the peace-building community?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the two questions relating to trust and the dual use are kind of somewhat related in that I think, there is a dimension to the work we do that is kind of taking technologies which are used to sow mistrust or distrust in migration, for migrant people on the move, for example, and we kind of reverse engineer those technologies in a way to sow mistrust against the organizations perpetrating this this type of violence. And this is, I think this, this is most definitely difficult. I think that the conception of it that we have it more or less in our work, I think, is that right now, in the current political climate, let's say, of mistrust, we are often working, unfortunately, in terms of holding organizations accountable for their actions. But there is a kind of, embedded within this, I think there is a view for a kind of democratization of trust or surveillance in a way that I think any government organization enacting any form of surveillance onto a community there should be a systemic oversight of that very organization, be it a government or a private organization, and that oversight should be democratized in a way that it can be affected by affected communities. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a sort of a vision to the work we do that in the future this won't kind of stop when things get better, but in fact this will transition from an architecture of accountability to an architecture of trust somehow. And in the process, re-engineer the kind of political landscape of whom has a voice, basically, within this system of ubiquitous kind of ambient surveillance, as you were describing.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for that. We have more questions from the audience. I know there was one here, that I saw before.
Just really quick, would it help to move the border?
Would it help to move the border? That was the question. Okay. Well, we're going to take two more. Yeah, I can see over here. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think mine is more of a general question, really. And it goes to the organizations working on peace and all these topics, but also policymakers who may be in the room, because I get confronted with the dilemma of how do we manage to achieve digital integrity while addressing global inequalities. I work with a non-profit in Germany, but we also work with our activities and projects target participants from the so-called Global South. And the German non-profit is completely against American stuff. You don't use Google Drive, you don't use Google Forms, because that's bloody American. And they want us to use stuff that's made in German, in Europe. We have our clouds, which we can use, which is very nice. And then we have participants who are supposed to register from Kenya or from Rwanda, and when you tell them, we can't use Google Form, they say, then do it yourself, because that's what we have access to, that's what we can afford, that's what is available to us. So how do we manage this digital integrity and data security while also paying attention to these global inequalities, but also without burdening the people who can't build the systems that we want to use?
Yeah, perfect.
Yes, I just, in ways, wanted to push a bit on the democratization of the surveillance. It seems to me that really very, very few companies are holding really massive amounts of data across health, policing, security, and we don't really have any way at all of understanding whether those are firewalled from each other and what the methods are that they're using. I suppose it makes me despair a little bit of what the capacity is to actually go into that black box and start to, bring what are traditional forms of accountability. And I just wondered, are there any innovative ideas out there for alternative ways of doing that?
Thank you, Christine. And so I'm actually going to suggest that you all pick what you would like to speak on to these questions, but just to summarize, would it help to move borders in some of the things we've been talking about? What is the balance in between digital integrity and global inequality? I want to say we get the same question when people are like, should you use Signal or should you use WhatsApp? Few companies hold a lot of the data. It's a black box. Are they firewalled? How do we get into that black box? How do we understand what they actually know about us, or they know about different people? Ophelia, can I ask you to go first with any of that, whichever one you want to address?
Obviously, the question is, what about moving the border? Even if the border was moved, it comes with all of that militarization that's just going to move with it, because there's people that control that borders and control immigration policies that affect all the peoples. So moving borders is not an option. Maybe erasing borders and being human is more of an option.
Mm-hmm.
Bruna, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm still reflecting on the question on the global majority. I think maybe I'll start with the same idea that it's impossible to go forward in a more equitable way if we don't have, women, queer community, other minorities joining the development of those technologies, right? We're not just talking about dominance of certain actors, but we're also talking about the development of it. And historically, we don't have. Historically, it's developed by the same group of white, global northern men who put forward the same biases and the same, problems that have also helped strengthen the structures of power that each and every single of our countries, groups, and spaces they suffer from. So I'm not really providing an answer to that, but to me, the answer lies in inclusion on the development of those technologies, and making sure that they actually reflect the values and principles that are relevant to all of us. Like for me, for instance, it's not important that I use Google, but for me, it's more important that I have technologies that are accessible for my friends in Taiwan or for my friends, in certain parts of China, than to have something that works the same way that Google does. So again, it's really important to consider these different perspectives and ideas and thoughts into that, and have, users and the ones that need to be at the table at the very center of the table, not in the corners just talking whenever needed or called on, but really at the core of it. Yeah.
Jack?
Yeah, I think in response to the last question, I think there's definitely, it evokes a sense of dismay, let's say, the systemic inaccessibility and non-transparency to data, generally speaking, be it like privately held or governmentally held. I think, our work it's typified by the initial stage is just working with teams to file innumerable amounts of freedom of information requests, full knowing that the majority, if not the totality of this, will be rejected. I would hope that would change in the future, and I think there's a lot of work in numerous ways to create a landscape of transparency that is radically different. But I think at least in our work, I think a lot is really taking the act of archiving and as a sort of insurgent act, as an act of resistance, as the act of creating our own kind of data sets, for example, against police violence, against pushbacks, against instances of human rights abuses. I think this is really where we see the majority of our work lies, is really the development of new open source data sets which precisely try and compile fragments of that which is systemically hidden. And of course it definitely doesn't account for the kind of ubiquity of hidden data, but I think there is a real kind of importance in the act of archiving as a kind of insurgent process that, yeah, I think is the way at least we see as kind of the operable terms to push against that.
Thank you. So we have time for one last round of questions, and then we're going to close. So, your last chance. There's somebody here.
Good evening. Jack, who would sponsor that? Who would finance that? That wouldn't be technological companies. Would they be interested in that? Would that be government? I have to say I'm an etatist, a declaration. And as you were saying, like we need to bring people into the equation. Like we need to, make the government like accountable and have them working with the people who they're affecting. Yeah. But what about the European Commission? You know, we don't elect European Commission. So I have these two questions for you, like who would sponsor what you just said, and I second it, yeah. I totally agree with that. And how do we then talk about the European Commission? Thank you.
I can see somebody back there.
I'll do it in Spanish and she translates.
And I will translate.
Yeah, thank you. Es una pregunta un poco curiosa. Parte de mi coherencia personal y de mi modo de ver la ética pasa por lo local, ¿no? En que la globalidad es un problema en sí misma y que si no existieran actores globales no existirían muchos de los problemas que existen, ¿no? Entonces, pero veo que también son parte de la solución. Que a los problemas que causan actores globales se tiene que responder con otros actores globales que hagan las cosas mejor, ¿no? Pero mi pregunta es el cómo fusionar estas dos cuestiones, ¿no? Bueno, es una pregunta abierta. Bueno, también aquí lo voy a responder. ¿Cómo ligar una ética de lo local con cuestiones globales como estos problemas?
Bruna's going to help me.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try my best. So the point that she was making is that she says a lot of what she sees is that a lot of the problems that she sees are global problems or imposed by global actors that wouldn't exist if we didn't have these global actors, if we only had local actors. And yet she also understands that because we have these global actors that are causing problems locally, we need other global actors that are better, that have better ethics to respond to these global issues. And so the question is, how do we merge those? The ethics of the local with these kind of global problems. How did I do? Do you want to correct my translation? Was that good?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Great. And I'm seeing one last question at the back. Julie.
Thank you, everyone. Hi, I'm Julie. I'm keep thinking about this, the framing of this as dilemmas, and I keep thinking about the areas in which there might be broad agreement that we would like surveillance to happen. We might broadly agree that we want surveillance to capture the online activity of those who are using their online work to harm children. We might broadly agree that we want surveillance to happen for those who might be planning imminent attacks. So I wonder if there are areas in which, this is connected to Guy's question about trust and about maybe democratic participation in deciding what these surveillance systems should look like. Are there any spaces where those conversations are happening beyond the just rejection of surveillance?
Okay, so just to recap, we have a question about who would sponsor this kind of work, Jack specifically referencing the European Commission. We have a question about marrying the local ethics with some of the global issues that we have. We have a final question about whether are there any areas of agreement where there could be broad agreement that surveillance is actually in the public good. I'm paraphrasing. So I invite all of you to say something to any of these things and also any closing statements that you want to make. And we're going to go backwards this time. So Jack, can I start with you?
Okay, yeah. I in answer to your first question regarding the funding, I mean, Yeah, it's definitely, as I'm sure many people in the room are as well now, the funding landscape has become increasingly difficult in the recent, last 2 years. And I think that already before then, there was this, dilemma of, accepting kind of, effectively asking funds. A lot of our work is, for example, funded by the European Union or the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and this is effectively money tied to European states that are in some ways giving funds to projects which then inherently criticize the European Union's modus operandi. And, ironically enough, I'm an architect, we work with a lot of designers, a lot of people in the creative kind of profession alongside environmental scientists, social scientists as well. But I think sometimes we're kind of almost selling ourselves more as, it's difficult to get funding sometimes for these type of projects legitimately in a social science space, but then all of a sudden, if it's an art exhibition, that kind of work becomes somewhat valid, or it's treated in a less serious, less kind of volatile way. There's a more kind of, that from a governmental perspective, there's this kind of, you must fund the arts, and the arts is going to be reactionary, and this is a somewhat kind of assumed modus operandi. So I think we kind of work a little bit in that space of trying to co-opt a little bit an approach to the creative arts, and then kind of try and worm our way back into sort of legal fora and spaces of kind of more legitimate accountability in the eyes of the government. I think also in terms of I guess this also links a little bit to the final question about kind of, spaces of agreement and so forth. I mean, definitely, I think when dealing, perhaps one thing that at least in recent years, I'm not sure if this is really the case anymore, but there was, of course, there was previously to a certain degree a kind of consensus around the systemic issues of, for example, environmental degradation for all, members of the community. Unfortunately, this consensus is rapidly deteriorating. But a lot of the times we have tried to exactly kind of embed issues of ecology, kind of moving into the field of political ecology and trying to sort of paint these projects as not just projects that are dealing with sort of surveillance, but are also looking at kind of environmental degradation as a process of state-sponsored violence and so forth. And I think this is a space that at least there was and is a possibility for a kind of wider spectrum of agreement, I think, at least in our experience.
Thank you.
I would just jump in from the EU perspective. I think there's so many things to correct about the EU. I would first like for them to correct their position on data protection and all the omnibus that might result in many sad things for us in terms of privacy and AI governance. So that's the only thing I'll say about the EU as a Brazilian. So that makes a lot of sense. About the local to global, I think Witness has been my first experience in a big global organization. I've always worked in either regional or national Brazilian organizations, and it's indeed a challenge to try to translate and to elevate the issues that happen in our local realities to an international kind of audience, and try to escalate why does it matter, I remember when Bolsonaro was the president and we were trying to escalate all the, the abuses that were going on, and people would be like, well, but that's kind of Latin America. And I'm like, no, destroying the rule of law, it's not kind of Latin America. It's something that just shouldn't exist regardless of the region of the world. So maybe just to say that the way we have been working at Witness is that the local feeds the global. And we have been hosting consultations in Latin America, in Brazil, in certain regions of the African countries and so on, in order to help guide our policies. And then one of our projects is called Fortifying Community Truth. We just had a workshop in Kenya, talking to the local communities and trying to discuss, the challenges into verifying news, into trying to tackle disinformation, and how activists should deal with that. So I really think that, especially working in a global environment, we should always really be guided by the local experiences and the first-hand one. There's no way the peace building or the human rights spaces will go forward without, the experiences of the frontline defenders, the journalists, and the activists and everyone that's on the table. And maybe I'll just stop by saying that today is a very happy day for us, that Bolsonaro was finally arrested. So, yeah. I just didn't want to go down without saying that. So
Thank you for sharing that and reminding us of that. Ophelia.
Well, I'm sitting here thinking that there is no human dignity in surveillance. We have our universities receiving, massive funding for development of surveillance that are being used on my people. I'm just a grandmother cultivating our traditional seeds, but I'm under surveillance. My neighbor, goes to get wood so they can fire their wood stove to eat, and they're under surveillance. There is just no answer to that and no response to them, other than, there is no dignity in, this surveillance technology that continues to, just overextend in our lives. And I do use a phone, Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for everything that you've shared and that you've taken the time to share with us today. That is the end of the day today. I think we have Chema who will come and give us some more announcements. But before that, can you please give this panel a big round of applause? Thank you, Tua.
Okay, thank you very much. Just some quick announcements. First, remember, if you have translation devices, please give it back at the reception because we need them for tomorrow. And I guess after this session, we're ready for some drinks and music. So who has signed up for the reception party? Okay, a few of you, good. So now we need to move to this place. It's called Pavelló Canigó, and it's 30 minutes walk from here, but you don't need to walk if you want. We have some minibuses ready for you. So just from here, at 6:30, 6:45, and 7, we will have buses from here going directly to the reception, so you can take the buses and you can go outside. But if you want to walk, it's a nice 30 minutes walk. I know it's cold, but maybe after being here the whole day, you want to walk and stretch a little bit your legs. We will have some guides outside, and then we'll leave the venue at 6:15. Okay? The party is going to start in this place. This is the main entrance, so please don't get lost. And this is the building. And if you check your the WhatsApp group, the announcements channel, you have already the pin if you want to walk on your own. But remember that we have our guides waiting for you. So please go by bus, go walking, but let's see you soon in the reception party, and we will have some drinks and music together. And remember that tomorrow we wait for you here at 9 a.m. So thank you very much, and see you now in the Pavelló Canigó. Sorry. And we have one bus at 7 leaving from the Ibis Hotel. If somebody's in the hotel, at 7 we will have a bus from the hotel to the pavilion.